Today's episode is brought to you by Destiny O Birdsong's Negotiations, a collection of poems that Elizabeth Acevedo describes as full of wonder. Says Natalie Diaz, Negotiations is an intimate, stunning collection. Destiny O Birdsong's poems examine systems of power and oppression, violence, complicity. These poems are desire, survival, the body, rage, vulnerability, a fierce celebration of Black womanhood. Adds Donica Kelly, the terms of Destiny O Birdsong's negotiations are scalding and tender. Birdsong excavates a national history and her speakers' personal histories, tracks how their intersections and aftermaths wreak havoc in the woman who survives. But Birdsong's negotiations' endgame is not simply survival. It aims to flourish. Negotiations is out now from Tin House. Today's conversation has existed in my anticipatory imagination for many years now. As I mentioned at the beginning of it, I don't miss a chance to see Natalie Diaz read and speak on her work. And so in a way, she's been preparing me for this conversation long before it was on both of our calendars as something for me to prepare for. An added bonus is that in our collective ongoing brainstorm about who listener supporters of the show would most like to see as future guests of Between the Covers, it is Natalie's name that comes up over and over again. So I'm happy to say that we've arrived, that the future is now, and we are now able to spend an extended time with Natalie and her practice in words and in the world. When I was brainstorming what to suggest she might read for the bonus audio archive, I knew that she had a fondness for Jorge Luis Borges's poetry, something that isn't read nearly as much as his other work. But she decided to do something even better. For the bonus archive, she reads from Borges's Bestiary, the Book of Imaginary Beings, introducing us to 3 of these beasts and talking about the way Borges disrupts history and why that is important. If that isn't enough of an enticement to transform yourself from a listener of Between the Covers to a listener supporter, recently several past guests of the show have offered some really amazing things to future supporters of the show. I haven't had the chance to get them all up on the site yet, but here are some of the ones that are now available up on Patreon. Sophia Samatar has offered a sold-out and thus unavailable hand-sewn chapbook of her story Meet Me in Iram, and a story by her speculative fiction comrade Kat Howard, Those Are Pearls, a chapbook they've already mailed between themselves in anticipation of this, so that it is signed by both of them. Aro Kwan and Sheila Hetty have offered their own versions of a consultation to answer a writer's questions about writing and the writing process. Vicky Now has offered a consultation and feedback on a poem. Molly Crabapple has offered signed copies of both of her books, Drawing Blood and Brothers of the Gun, a perfect duo for someone interested in image text or the intersection of social justice journalism, literary writing, and illustration. And Carmen Maria Machado is offering signed copies of the British edition of her latest book, In the Dream House. All of this is on top of the usual perks and enticements. So to hear about imaginary beasts, or to claim one of these generous gifts from past guests, or to find out other benefits of becoming a supporter of Between the Covers, most notably to me, that you are essentially ensuring that the show steps into the future on solid footing, head over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program with Natalie Diaz.
These stories are about the id have some kind of magical effect in the world. I think it's really hard to live without stories. And if somebody tells you, like, this is the way you're going to end up, you're lucky if you can forget that.
You know, there's me, and then there's writer guy me, and then there's me working, which is the absence of me. It's just story.
Had no idea how to write a novel, didn't know if it would ever come to fruition. Was working at a vet and kind of lint rolling puppy hair and cat dander off myself.
They're almost like really shy animals. They will come out of the woods, but you have to stay very still, and you have to pretend like you're not interested in them.
Artists tend to put their fingers in the wounds, in the silences.
I believe in the role of literature as a catalyst for dialogue and new forms of thinking.
All the stuff I'm interested in is thrown into the washing machine that is my brain, and it's put on spin.
Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naimon, your host. Today's guest is poet and linguist Natalie Diaz. Diaz earned her undergraduate degree and her MFA in poetry at Old Dominion University. Diaz is an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian community and has worked with the last speakers of the Mojave language, where she directed their language revitalization program. Diaz is also a former professional basketball player, point guard at Old Dominion, a team that made it to the NCAA Sweet 16 3 times and the Final Four once during her tenure, and she played professional basketball in Europe and Asia prior to pursuing her degree in poetry. Diaz is currently the Maxine and Jonathan Marshall Chair in Modern and Contemporary Poetry and director of the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at Arizona State University. She has also been an ambassador for the University of Arizona's Art for Justice project, which commissions work from writers who are addressing the issue of mass incarceration. Natalie Diaz's 2012 debut collection of poetry from Copper Canyon Press, When My Brother Was an Aztec, was a winner of the American Book Award and was a finalist for the PEN Open Book Award. Diaz's writing has appeared everywhere from The New Yorker to ESPN. It has garnered a Pushcart Prize, the Narrative Prize for Poetry, the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, otherwise known as the Genius Grant, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, and a Native Arts Council Foundation Artist Fellowship, among many others. She's also the editor of Bodies Built for Game, the Prairie Schooner anthology of contemporary sports writing, which includes writing by Louise Erdrich, Hanif Abdurraqib, Terrence Hayes, Claudia Rankin, Roger Reeves, Fatima Ashgar, and many others. Natalie Diaz is here today on Between the Covers for her much-anticipated follow-up to When My Brother Was an Aztec, her latest poetry collection from Grey Wolf, called Postcolonial Love Poem, a collection that is one of 5 finalists for the National Book Award in Poetry this year. Booklist, in its starred review, calls Postcolonial Love Poem a groundbreaking and unparalleled lyric work. Poet and editor John Freeman calls it a breakthrough collection and says, in a world where nothing feels so conservative as a love poem, Diaz takes the form and smashes it to smithereens, building something all her own, a kind of love poem that can allow history and culture and the anguish of ancestors to flow through and around the poet as she addresses her beloved. Amelia Phillips says in the New York Times Book Review, Diaz's collection is no doubt one of the most important poetry releases in years, one to applaud for its considerable demonstration of skill, its resistance to dominant perspectives, and its light wrought of desire. Finally, Louise Erdrich says, with tenacious wit, ardor, and something I can only call magnificence, Diaz speaks of the consuming need we have for one another. This is a book for any time, but especially a book for this time, these days, and who knows for how long. We can only touch a trusted small number of people. Diaz brings depth and resonance to the fact that this has always been so. Be prepared to journey down a wild river. Welcome to Between the Covers, Natalie Diaz.
Gracias for having me and for that generous opening. It feels like now we're here with other people, so it's, doesn't have to just be me here in front of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, gracias.
Well, over the past 10 years, I've tried to never miss an opportunity to see you read. And one of the things I've always appreciated about your readings and lectures is the way you often bring up a word that you distrust, a word that often, I think, comes with a lot of goodwill attached to it. So one time it might be the word sustainability, another time it might be truth or empathy or citizen. So it seems like a good place to start our conversation by looking at the words in the title of the collection. And I wanted to start with your thoughts, or what thoughts come to mind when you employ the words postcolonial love.
I think a lot about postcolonial itself, and of course love. Love is one given to us all very early. You should love this person, or most importantly and detrimentally, you shouldn't love this person, or what that means. It's both of these words for me are compelling because they are both so generic. I was told love, but was never really told about its capaciousness or how I might exist in it. And so I knew it was something I should aspire to as a type of goodness. And I also began to realize when I was disallowed from entering it, this kind of the profane, that love was inside the temple and I was perpetually, outside the temple. And postcolonial is, again, it's the condition, I think, of language for many natives or many indigenous peoples, is that we should be engaging with postcolonial, decolonial in some way. And those words, I guess I have a great gift of poetry in that it gives me time to relocate myself or the people I love in a language. When I think about postcolonial, I don't know that we know what it means, because it shouldn't mean something. It should be a series of acts or practices, or a way that I encounter and move my body, or the way that I encounter others and respect or honor their bodies in some way. And for me to set those together, I mean, it came up tongue in cheek, to be honest. Because the love poem is a place that I wander in often, that I return to often, that I find some of my, I guess what I find in the love poem is a place that's not the future, it's not the past, it's not now, it's a place that can't be confined in that way, because in some ways it's the ecstatic. And is the ecstatic outside of the body? Is it inside the body? Well, in some ways, the idea of the love poem to me is an energy much larger than I am. Like, in some ways, I think the energy of the world that has made itself, the literal world, from cosmos to dirt to mountain, that to me feels very ecstatic. And so I guess setting those two things side by side happened because I was having a conversation, and I don't know who the conversation was with. It's often with my friend Roger or, my partner. But we were talking about a poem, and I was like, well, I guess all of my poems are postcolonial in some way. And we were just kind of laughing a little bit about that possibility. But yeah, and I mean, I guess that's, for me, that's like the luck and the question of, and the desire that language inspires in me or offers me, is that words are just symbols. And the real interaction I have with language is not that a word means something, but what I might do in relationship to that word, on my way toward it, or in my misunderstanding of it, or in the ways it was handed to me.
I wanted to ask you about...
Sorry, my answers are long. I know.
No, that's a great answer. I love that answer.
I'm a nightmare for interviews.
No, this is the place for long answers, and you'll see some long questions too. I wanted to ask you about love in relationship to a conversation you were recently in about translation and democracy, where you talked about the sensuality of what we don't or can't know of the other, and about your interest in what can't or shouldn't be translated. And I wondered if you saw love in that light, a place where the unknowable doesn't necessarily become known, doesn't become translated, but rather is welcome to coexist on its own terms.
I really appreciate that question because it feels very, I guess what I mean is that question feels very generous to me because it's a place I'm wandering in that space and trying to make sense of it, or maybe not trying to make sense of it, but trying to continue discovering in that space, in the space of that question. And I'm going to bring in my partner and I's relationship because this is a place where I've been thinking like, so, I'm a poet, my book is out, all of these things are happening. And there's a way that I've realized that language, yes, it's a part of me and it's important to me, but I'm having a really hard time just like stepping in and talking about craft. It's not that I'm not engaged in what is a line break, but I'm only engaged in it in terms of how it catalyzes or energizes or what the energy of a word or a language can do in that respect. And so for me, thinking in this way about, when I think about poetry, I guess what I'm thinking about is what is the language that's meaningful for me? Some of it does go into my poetry, yet the greater body of that language happens far outside of poetry. And when I'm thinking about, ideas of translation, I'm thinking a lot, like many of us are, about knowledge. What is knowledge? Who determines the value of knowledge? Once that value is determined, who then determines how it is disseminated and to whom it's disseminated? And for me, thinking of knowledge as, the way knowledge exists, I think it's the very nature of the word. It's a word I don't trust. The very nature of the word implies that it can be extracted, it can be consumed, it can be again made sense of, and it can be made to have value. We see that in a very different way than we've seen it before right now in the language of the political or the language of the public or the language of Twitter. But when I'm thinking about these knowledges, and there are many indigenous artists who speak about this, visual artists, and who I spend a lot of time in their work and the ways they write about their work. But the importance of having a knowledge that I don't have to translate, and most importantly, that can't be translated. Like that to me is an intimacy that maybe intimacy is not the right word. I guess the basic ways I'm thinking about this is that because we live in America, because the power of Western structures of democracy, of empire, of nation, government, all of these things, because they have created this system in which they decide, what knowledge is based on if they can take it, right? So like indigenous bodies of knowledges, so we have like indigenous knowledge systems, things like that. They're so important to resist what is academic knowledge or these many centers of knowledge because they're knowledges that can't be taken. And they can't be taken because the people who try to extract them from the communities don't understand them. And so, knowledge has this terrible power structure of, if I can take it from you, then it's valuable. But if I can't, then it doesn't mean anything. And this is the way we've pushed so many knowledges out. This is why we don't let indigenous peoples into certain conversations. This is why we don't want queer, trans, non-binary, non-gender conforming peoples in conversations. This is why we don't want Black farmers in conversations. And it's because the kind of white system of knowledge, the Western system of knowledge, couldn't take it and do or make something of it to reiterate itself. And so for me, that whatever questions I can form from that have been extremely important. And the language that matters to me most right now is the language that my partner and I are making in our home. And it's not an easy language. My partner is Black, I'm Indigenous and Latina or Mexican. We're both queer. We're out in the middle of this little desert town on my reservation. And that private language that we have in our home feels the most important to me. We are both poets, so there's a certain way that we pull some of that language into our work and ways that we don't. And to me, we have a knowledge with each other that other people might not understand. And importantly, my partner knows, experiences, knowledges that I will never understand. And I have no desire to consume those things. And I think we've moved away from that because knowledge has been knowledge is a product, right? Knowledge is currency. It's, even now I'm in academia. And so there are certain things that must be translated to show my institution that I am accomplishing something or I am successful in something. And so what that means is we assume we can translate everything and that I can know everything. Like, oh, what are you doing? Well, okay, I can know, tell me about that. And now I know it. But what I believe one of the things that's missing, and I believe that this is why returning to very old and indigenous relationships and knowledges is so important right now. And by indigenous, I don't just mean what we call native. I mean any peoples who've had relationships with the land, who've learned from the land and who've been shaped by it in some way, is that like what makes us who we are the knowledges that we can't translate to somebody, and it's really difficult to protect those knowledges because of the society we live in. Yet those knowledges will be the ones that, if anything saves us, whatever saving means to somebody, it will be those. It will be the fact that I do not know what it's like to be a Black queer woman, which is a knowing my partner has. She does not know what it's like to be Native, a Mojave, Akamalam, Mexican queer woman. And that doesn't mean we won't build our own knowledges together, but it's important that we might not understand each other. Like, I really believe in misunderstanding or not understanding. I think it's one of the most natural states of our being. And yet here we are together, and here we are and living in that tension, and that it really is that tension where we exist as kind of a third or a fourth entity. That's a really long answer, but it also feels important to me in terms of the ideas of love and ecstasy. Like, I do think love is a not knowing. I think that it is the willingness or the ability or the luck of being in the space between what we know of one another and again, very valuably, what we don't know about one another, and yet can still be alongside.
Well, I love what you're saying in relationship to my relationship to the cover of the book, because it feels like the cover is the perfect embodiment of some of what you're saying, in the sense that, are you revealing your face? Are you in the process of revealing your face on the cover, or are you in the process of concealing your face on the cover? Maybe both, maybe neither. And then the blurriness of your hand, which maybe that's making visible that space between us. The making of eye contact, but also making visible the distance at the same time. I don't know if that's anything behind what this portrait is, but it certainly is what I thought of. And it doesn't feel knowable. It feels like there are multiple answers or maybe no answers.
I like what you said. Like, it doesn't feel knowable, and the term that I've used lately, and I'm one of those people, I cycle through words because sometimes I find a word and it's the change I needed. And I spend time in that word and the word doesn't change enough for me. So then I have to find a new set of words. But right now, a word that's really important to me is unpinnable. Mm. And I've referenced it a few times in conversations, but the importance of being unpinnable, especially for a person like me. And the photos on the book were part of a self-portrait project that I did. And originally I was asked to respond, reply, react. Those are always awful words when you're asking an Indigenous person, like, can you please respond to this or react to this? But it was Edward Curtis's some large number of an anniversary, of their work in the Pacific Northwest. And, they were very thoughtful in bringing in Indigenous voices to respond to that. And Edward Curtis had taken photos of Mojaves. In fact, one of the most famous photos, which I've recently seen on books that are not about Mojaves, and is they called her Moja, or sometimes Mu, or they basically got her name wrong, and it was not her name, it was her clan name, and so the clan name was Ma. And so there's this picture of this young girl, and then of course many other natives. But as people know, Edward Curtis would often dress you in other people's regalia or other people's quote artifacts, and then they were required to stand still, to be pinned down by his projection of what he wanted people to know of what he thought of natives. So of course it was like, I'm trying to capture this moment so that as we move forward, we don't lose this moment. And that's the typical American way of thinking about natives. We're always a footnote. Even so much modern contemporary literature is, I don't know how many times I've seen a line such as this that says, and our native brothers and sisters, or, and we're on unceded territory, or, and we're on, stolen land, as if that acknowledges us in any way. And really by doing that, that's saying we don't exist. Mm-hmm. We exist only in that past. And so when I was interacting with those photos, I wouldn't even say I'm a budding photographer. I love images. I love reading about photography. I've never taken any kind of training or course with this, but what I did with these photos, what I wanted to do with these photos is to be unknown, like as you're saying, to be unpinnable. And so one of the goals was that, how can I take some of what is normally a marker of being Indigenous, like even the bangs? I feel like if someone wants you to know that they're Indigenous, they'll cut their bangs real blunt or something, because we often do that. But in every one of the photos, I wore a quote artifact. So I was wearing some, like my tribe does beadwork. So I was wearing the collars or the bracelets with our Mojave colors in them. And so in the photos, what I was trying to do was, if there was a focus on anything, I wanted it to be just on that artifact, in recognition of, that's an artifact, I am not. And so how do I stay beyond that? And he also has a lot of photos where it seemed as if he was trying to put the women in a position of being kind of coy. So maybe they had a slight smile on their face. And so for me, the way I set up the cameras, I wanted to make sure my body was in motion, and that the image was very clearly unable to capture that motion, to kind of defy again or disallow some of the photos. But yeah, I think you're exactly right in terms of thinking about it as the unknowable. Like, I didn't want there to be a projection able to be made where someone could say, this is what I think of Indigenous peoples, or this is what I think of natives.
Well, let me ask you another language specific question, in the sense that when you're giving public readings and talks, you begin with some words in Mojave, and then you follow those words with Spanish. And then we hear words in English. And yet the poetry itself is inverted in this sense. Most of the words are in English. There are occasional words in Spanish, and very rarely, almost never, there are words in Mojave. And I wondered if this decision not to employ Mojave words in the context of the poems themselves is related in some way to allowing the unknowable or allowing the untranslatable through withholding the words.
So Mojave is still very physical to me. It's still very much my land and my home. And some of that is for traumatic reasons, right? There aren't many people who I can speak with. If I want to speak in Mojave, I talk with my teacher. If he wants to speak in Mojave, the number of people he can speak with is not high. And even my quote, fluency or ability, which we don't usually talk about in indigenous revitalization, because it really doesn't, it's, if there was any measure, it is the measure that says America and other nations or empires tried to, wipe us off the face of the earth. And the first thing they did was still our ways of speaking to and of one another. That's the only measure. And so to come in and think about who can speak, who speaks well, who speaks fluently, it's the least important, and it's someone else's measurement on us. Like just one example, my teacher, his name is Amat Chumich Mahakev, or Hubert McCord, and he is our last bird singer. He's one of my best friends. He's funny. He's like, we're kind of an unlikely relationship, and we're also like perfect together. And he's also my relative. But one day I came in and, he was telling me like, hey, you've come so far. Like, I remember when you showed up and you barely knew anything the first day. And we've been together for years. So, and he's like, yeah, like if you look over there, and he pointed, in one direction, he's like, look over there, and remember way over there, that's when you didn't know anything. And he's like, and now you're right here, and look how far you've come. And if he was just pointing toward nothing. And then, so I had like this kind of, probably beam in my face and a little bit of confidence, and that, that old basketball feeling where like, okay, I'm winning in some way. And then he pointed in the other direction, and he's like, and now look how far you have to go. And he's like, you don't know nothing. There's a funny phrase that I've heard many times where in elder, Hubert has never been rough with me in that way, but some of my elders have said like, this is the way they say it too. And it will give you a feeling of what I feel when I hear it, but they'll say, you don't know nothing. And the way that they say that, you feel it. You feel the emptiness of what you do not know in your body and in your mind. But yeah, so Mojave for me, it has a place, and it's a place of love. It's a place of pain. It's a place of extreme desire and weight. It's a place of energy. I think for me, the language that feels almost like pure energy is the Mojave language, because it hasn't been, it's definitely been filtered through, through colonialism, through this country, and not just here. There are indigenous languages all over, like Africa is full of indigenous languages, Russia, all of these places. So it's been filtered in those ways, but it hasn't been filtered with some of the greed and some of the performance and some of the selfishness, I think, that other languages have, English in particular. And so it exists in a different way. Like when we speak about nouns, there are also things we can do. When we speak about a place, we're speaking about what has happened there. And so everything is so physical that it's just a reminder that I'm a body connected to this body that is language, which has come up from this land, which is a body. And so it's difficult to bring it on the page. When I do bring it on the page, it's because it's the only thing, it's because there is no English to carry it. And in the second book, in Postcolonial Love Poem, the first water is the body, is the place where I feel like I've given my readers one of the most powerful words I know. In Hamakav, in Hahavil, in just saying in Yech Hamakav Idum, like to I feel like I've given my readers a gift in that, which is to hear, and not me, I don't even mean me, because in some ways there's a speaker in the book, but to hear someone say, this is who I am. And it's not about I as an ego or I as a flesh body, but it's I as a being. And I feel it every time I say it, every time I read it. And so, and then the other piece where I said maybe something that other Mojaves might think to not say, but I said my name in Mojave, which I don't often say to people in person, but and that was in the poem Snake Light, where I come out and say what my name is, and I say what it means. And that name is from my great grandmother. And so, and I don't feel any kind of betrayal there, but what I feel is that I'm slowly learning not how to make Mojave exist in English, but to give Mojave a place within this other language that it can't be touched.
Yeah. No, it makes me think a little bit of a conversation I had with the poet Mary Kim Arnold, and we were talking about a quote by your fellow National Book Award finalist, Don Che, where she was talking about how Korean and English are not transnationally equal. Oh yeah, that's such an amazing book.
I have Donnie's book here, and
yeah.
I spent so much time in it.
Yes, and with South Korea being a neo-colony of the U.S. for 70 years, it's impossible for the two languages or the two sides of the hyphen of a hybrid identity to be relating to each other in equal ways. And it sort of feels like the ritual that you do before each reading is reminding us of that even you start with Mojave, you then go to Spanish, then you go to English, but the subsequent talk is going to just be in English, and that is not by accident. That's a product of power and erasure, and sort of reminds us again of the way these languages are in relationship to each other. And before we hear some poems, I just wanted to stay on this notion one more beat around love in relationship to empathy. And it's something that you said that I remember you saying a long time ago, but I was unable to find it. So I don't know if my memory is totally off. So I might be saying this incorrectly, but I wondered if, made me think of how like translation, empathy is usually put forth as an inherent good, that the ability to know and to understand the other is something to strive for. But another way to look at empathy, which feels related to your model of translation, is that unlike sympathy, empathy is presumptuous, that it presumes that we could know the other. And in this talk that you gave, at least in my memory of this talk you gave, you were talking about empathy as a hunting technique from Scandinavia, as a way to intuit and know the moves of your prey. So in a sense, a technique of a predator. And I don't know if I'm getting that right, but does it provoke any recollection on your part?
Can you kind of go back through that last part again, as like where we kind of move into like thinking about the idea of the predator?
Yeah. So if we think of in the general culture, translating something or having empathy for something are considered good. And they're both sort of predicated on this idea of coming to know something as being both possible and a good in its own right. And I was thinking about your notion of translation and also potentially of love, allowing for this space of not knowing, and maybe even the sensuality of love and desire coming from that space, not being bridged. And And then this talk that you gave up where you were skeptical of empathy, of the notion of knowing someone else's different experience. And I believe you were talking about it originating as a way to hunt, to imagine yourself into the thought processes of prey so that you could anticipate them and catch them. I don't know if that's true. I mean, is that true?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know the prey part, but I mean, I definitely feel that way about translation. And some of this goes back to knowledge. Like, there's a knowledge that's just for me and not for you. There's a knowledge that's just for my partner and I and not for others. There's a knowledge that is just for Mojaves and not for others. And you have those knowledges also. But there's a language that is maybe pre-verbal, or maybe incapable of being verbal. And to me, that's the most important thing, right? We have been taught that we can make meaning or make sense of everything. Like, how many times we've said it here, like, does that make sense? Do I make sense? And like, I talk with my students about this. I'm like, I don't know if it makes sense. It doesn't have to, but if this is where you're at trying to make sense, trying to make sense, if this is where you're at trying to figure out the question, trying to understand what is, outside the question, adjacent to the question, then that's all that matters, right? And that some of that, it's really tough with my students to let them know that, like, the poem is just the smallest part of what you're wondering, of what that experience is. And I don't believe in empathy. And some people really bucket that idea. Like, they get frustrated with it, and which I also think is interesting, but that's sideways from here. I don't believe I should ever deny, I don't even have the power to deny, but I don't feel the need to have an argument about a word someone needs for themselves, or a concept someone needs in order for them to feel they're being who they need to be or how they need to be. I guess the question I have, and this does relate to love, the question I have is, where is the action? Like, I feel like I have a body, and when I say a body, I mean a flesh body that has a power that I don't even understand to act, to interact. And some of that, I think, was intentionally meant for the earth, for what made me. And then everything else is naturally in relationship to other beings and other life, whether it's my river or the plant or my lover, or for me, like, a place I think a lot about is for the stranger. What does that mean for the stranger? To treat the stranger as a beloved. And sometimes we pretend that English is the action, that language is the action. I believe language is physical. I believe language is beyond us. But the thing I'm most interested in is what is the human action. And why that's important is because I think human is a very problematic word. From Sylvia Wynter to, one of my best friends, Roger Reeves, is constantly pressing on this idea of, like, what do we mean by human? Like, who can even be human, and who would want to be a human? And so I think a lot about that relationship, and what does it mean? Like, so I don't believe empathy is possible, and yet the fact that it's not possible is, to me, the most possible. The most possible scenario is, like, I have no idea what it feels like to be someone else. You might have lost your mother, and I might have lost my mother, but I have no idea what you feel like. I know what I feel like, and that might inspire me to have certain ways of caring or even avoiding, but it's not the same feeling, and it doesn't need to be.
Right.
Like, for me, the fact that I can be next to someone and not need to pretend I can be in their shoes, like, that's what life is. That to me is the ecstatic. And I mean, and I've written a little bit about this, and we had talks about this, but if there really was such a thing as empathy, we couldn't fucking stand it.
Yeah.
Because what is happening right now in the world, like, I mean, and we keep saying like kids in cages, but that it's worse than that. Like the ways that we are holding people in detention, men and women and children, the ways that we're pushing them through one of the worst corridors in the desert. And right now in the desert, the heat, the temperature is shifting. So you might think it's a relief for them and I'm talking about people crossing the U.S.-Mexico border who are not all Mexicans, who are not all Central and South Americans, many of whom are East Asian, an amazing portion that most people don't know, or a large percentage that most people don't know about, are coming from Africa. My partner does work with No More Deaths and also visits some of the detention centers. And because my partner is Black and there are very few Black people who do this, she's always set up with the Black women and, people from Haiti, people from Cameroon, and some of the things that they've been through. But the fact that we do that's happening right now, and even though, it's not the heat that will kill them right now, it will be hypothermia, or it will be some unimaginable violence that happens to them. That's happening right now as I'm sitting here having a conversation with you. And yet I made a good coffee, I'm drinking clean water. If there really was empathy, I wouldn't be able to take it. My mind would buckle beneath the things I quote know, but can't embody in that knowing. And I also feel like I don't know where empathy ends or begins. I have the same problem with the idea of witness. It's to say that I have empathy. It's like, for me, when I think about what is empathy, this is one lens of the way I think about it. It is me seeing or hearing about something that's happened to someone and being able to imagine how I would feel if it happened to me. It has nothing to do with them. People are getting bombs dropped on them right now. We're sending, who knows how many American drones right now are, moving toward autonomous death, or, bringing entire family homes to rubble in the tribal areas outside Pakistan, and what's happening in Gaza right now. And because I can't imagine it happening to me, here we are.
Right.
And so I guess that's the thing, is the only thing that feels at stake in empathy is that it not happen to me.
Yeah.
So I struggle with that a little bit. And, I think about, I've been doing some work around this, and I have a friend who's doing work around this in a different area. And a while back I did some work at Vera List Center on freedom of speech, the idea of freedom of speech. And I don't feel like I don't think it's a valiant thing. I don't think it's a right. I actually think it's more harmful than good, the ways we've set up freedom of speech. I say that also understanding that I can speak and not be persecuted for it in ways that other people are, poets. But we were talking about the book Beloved, and we were talking about the character Sixo. And when they first introduce Sixo into the story, or when he first appears, they're talking about him being gentle, and they say, but that's when he was still speaking English then, but he stopped speaking English because there was no future in it. And that, and I don't take that in a very literal way, but to me, I'm really thinking about that, because all of our buzzwords, I don't know what a liberal is. I don't know what empathy is, all of these allyship. And it doesn't mean that they aren't useful for people. It just means that for me, I can't find the action in them. And I'm in a space where I am trying to figure out what I can do with a life And it doesn't, I'm not saying that I want to save the world. But sometimes the smallest gesture, you know, and I don't know what they are sometimes, but I'm searching for them. And poetry is one of those. I think of them as touch. It's one way I touch my life. And it's lucky that there's evidence or there's reply back that that the things I do touch other people's lives. But that to me feels like the lucky part. Yeah, so I spin around in some of those things. And again, it's not that I feel like I know something about them. It's quite the opposite. It feels like it feels like I want a different knowing than the one that's in my head that says, "Oh yeah, I know how you feel."
Yeah.
Because I don't.
Right.
I don't know that I ever will.
Well, if you're willing, I'd love to hear the opening poem, Postcolonial Love Poem, the poem that's set apart from the others between the epigraphs by Joy Harjo and Mahmoud Darwish. And then after that, if you are amenable, the American Arithmetic.
Both of those quotes that both of the epigraphs are quotes on either side of the poem are two writers who've been extremely important to me, and also just language that when I came across it, I knew at once how language also fails, but then I also knew our desire. The language is one of our desires to live. I'm just going to read those quotes and then I'll read the poem. So the epigraph that opens the book is from Joy Harjo's Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, which is just a book that I come back to again and again. I am singing a song that can only be born after losing a country. Joy Harjo. And Mahmoud Darwish, thinking about indigeneity and Palestine and Gaza and just some of the work Darwish has done, Journal of Ordinary Grief in the Presence of Absence, Fadi Judah translated on Butterfly's Burden. It's language beyond language. We admitted that we were human beings and melted for love in this desert. Mahmoud Darwish. Postcolonial love poem. I've been taught bloodstones can cure a snakebite, can stop the bleeding. Most people forgot this when the war ended. The war ended depending on which war you mean. Those we started before those millennia ago and onward, those which started me, which I lost and won, these ever-blooming wounds. I was built by wage, so I wage love and worse, always another campaign to march across a desert night for the cannon flash of your pale skin, settling in a silver lagoon of smoke at your breast. I dismount my dark horse, bend to you there, deliver you the hard pool of all my thirsts. I learned drink in a country of drought. We pleasure to hurt, leave marks the size of stones, each a cabochon polished by our mouths. I, your lapidary wheel turning green, mottled red, the jaspers of our desires. There are wildflowers in my desert which take up to 20 years to bloom. The seeds sleep like geodes beneath hot feldspar sand until a flash flood bolts the arroyo, lifting them in its copper current, opens them with memory. They remember what their God whispered into their ribs. Wake up and ache for your life. Where your hands have been are diamonds on my shoulders, down my back, thighs. I am your culebra. I am in the dirt for you. Your hips are quartz light and dangerous, two rose-horned rams ascending a soft desert wash before the November sky untethers a 100-year flood. The desert returns suddenly to its ancient sea. Arise the wild heliotrope, scorpion weed, blue phacelia, which hold purple the way a throat can hold the shape of any great hand. Great hands is what she called mine. The rain will eventually come or not. Until then, we touch our bodies like wounds. The war never ended and somehow begins again. And that, of course, was where Postcolonial love poem came from. Realizing that I could probably never write a poem that wasn't Postcolonial. You might hear some like buzzing going by. I live in the desert, so all of these people have like, they mostly drive dune buggies versus vehicles. So
I don't hear it too
their
bad.
trucks are like gigantic. We call them like God, Jeepers Creepers with like from that scary movie.
Yeah.
So I'll read American Arithmetic, and I don't know if we'll talk about this, but I was just struck by like statistics, right? Like that the fact that natives exist largely as statistics. And what I mean by that is we are barely considered, you know, how many times have we seen in the New York Times or large media? I think people had to fight for us to be represented in COVID, even though we have, you know, it struck us so bad, and there were a lot of journalists who were fighting for that. And so with this poem, I wanted, you know, it was just part of me demanding something beyond a statistic, or, you know, trying to think, you know, I guess trying to recognize the story of the statistic, or that the statistic is not us. The statistic is what America has put on us as a kind of stamp in some ways. And then there was also this, I was in a conversation where someone was talking about, you know, that statistics could never be emotional. American Arithmetic. Native Americans make up less than 1% of the population in America, 0.8% of 100%. Oh, mine efficient country. I do not remember the days before America. I do not remember the days when we were all here. Police kill Native Americans more than any other race. Race is a funny word. Race implies someone will win, implies I have as good a chance of winning as who wins the race that isn't a race. Native Americans make up 1.9% of all police killings, higher per capita than any race. Sometimes race means run. I'm not good at math. Can you blame me? I've had an American education. We are Americans, and we are less than 1% of Americans. We do a better job of dying by police than we do existing. When we are dying, who should we call? The police or our senator? Please, someone call my mother. At the National Museum of the American Indians, 68% of the collection is from the United States. I am doing my best to not become a museum of myself. I am doing my best to breathe in and out. I am begging. Let me be lonely, but not invisible. But in an American room of 100 people, I am Native American, less than one, less than whole. I am less than myself, only a fraction of a body. Let's say I am only a hand. And when I slip it beneath the shirt of my lover, I disappear completely.
We're talking today to the poet Natalie Diaz about her latest collection of poetry from Grey Wolf, Postcolonial Love Poem. I did want to talk about the statistics in American Arithmetic. The notion that this is probably news to most people, that there's no other group that is killed more frequently than Native Americans by police. And I've been thinking about that if we look at Black pain and injustice, it is made very visible as spectacle, and how how white mass murderers are arrested without being harmed, the media censoring the corpses of white bodies and of bodies coming home from our wars of any color. But at any time I can watch videos of any number of unarmed Black men and women killed by the police. And even if I haven't wanted to see those videos or photos, I've likely had them put in front of me. A knee on a neck, a grieving mother, undone and in distress. And in a recent conversation with Imani Perry and Kiesi Lehman called it the titillation that people get from the spectacle of Black pain. And Saidiya Hartman describes the consumption not just of Black pain, but of Black social life as something vampiric. But the positioning of Native Americans in the American discourse seems to be one of having no position. And I'm thinking, for instance, say Multnomah County, where Portland is the 9th largest urban Native American population in the United States. And there are 28 Native organizations in the Portland area. And yet I suspect most Portlanders wouldn't think of or know of a Native presence in the city whatsoever. And more to the point of your poem, crimes against Natives don't even make the news. They're non-events. The epidemic of disappeared and murdered Native women, that in 1980, 9% of female homicide victims were Indigenous, which is already wildly disproportionately high, but that increased to 24% by 2015. Or that in Canada, the homicide rate of Indigenous women is 6 times higher than the national average. But the epidemic is largely unknown, that most people probably can't name a single person by name, a single murdered Indigenous woman by name like they can Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown or Breonna Taylor. And I guess given how much we've talked about the ways others can't be known or understood when it comes to translation or love, if you could speak to this other phenomenon, the American arithmetic of this poem, which doesn't seem to put the Indigenous experience in the equation to begin with.
This is exactly the way America wanted it, right? It was erasure in order to take the land. So in some ways, it makes perfect mathematical sense of how America became itself. The same kind of terrible mathematics that that created and maintained chattel slavery for so long. And like, to me, one of the true losses is the separation of the oft separation of what this empire has done to anyone outside the recognizable and familiarity with a flesh body of power. You know, like our reservations, for example, were also the sites of Japanese American incarceration. Horrendous conditions and ways that they were treated. Thinking about the state of Chinese migrants or Chinese Americans and what they were put through. Imprisonment. Thinking about the beginning when the missions came and what happened to men and women and children of sexual abuse, and even a kind of forced labor or enslavement that didn't last because we also didn't last. To me, this is exactly what America wants. They want us to keep reestablishing what is the beginning. And this goes back to when I was talking about, footnotes. The statistics of, like, when we're thinking about, let's just think about land, because that's how most people think of natives. So we'll just join them right now with that lens. There's about 370 million indigenous peoples around the world. And we are responsible for or hold tenure over lands that are 85% of the world's biodiversity. Like, people do not realize, because they don't have to, because they are engaged as well in what is occupation and what is displacement, in what is like straightforwardly land theft. And it's not enough to say I'm on occupied territory, or, it's because that's not what land is about. It's about relationship. And it's not simply about whether we were brought here because we wanted to be, or whether we arrived here because of something as horrendous and inexplicable. There's no word I can put on the system of enslavement in America, and how that has not stopped, has just reorganized itself throughout time. Or what's happening right now with what we call refugee or migration. Migrations have always happened for terrible reasons, for natural reasons. And what we reduce indigeneity to is land. It's okay, pipelines. And, they polluted their water. Well, what's happening to natives with water, we're seeing happen in Flint, Michigan. That's connected. And until we make that connection, nothing will change until we connect what's happening to natives, natives meaning indigenous peoples in the Americas, to what's happening in Palestine or Gaza, to what's happening to Black men and women in the United States, in the Americas, again, in general, until we connect what is indigenous in terms of land to what is indigenous in terms of diasporic or dispersed people, who are also Black. In America, we have this tendency that Black only means one thing. We do the same thing with natives. Native only means one thing. We're all from different lands and languages. And to me, that invisibility is to our own detriment. It's a poison, right? And America came in, literally sometimes poisoned, destroying crops, destroying seed banks. We were out in our desert from one of our sister reservations, and we were out looking at some of the seeds in the desert that people might not notice were there, but that we once subsisted off of. But knowing just that troops came through and burned those seed caches, and then they grazed it so that they were gone. These are small things that are actually the large things. And I'm thinking again, I think that is such a striking point you've made about not knowing the names of people. The fact that there is no count for murdered or missing Black women in the United States. There is no count for murdered, missing Indigenous women in the United States. That is connected. What's happening to women in Ciudad Juarez, that is connected. And it's unbelievable to me and for me, some of why that's disconnected is because I think American scholarship has to do more. It's not enough to study it and to speak amongst one another about these things without considering what that information is, and that information actually exists in communities already. And what does it mean it is a type of extraction, I think, a lot of times when we take this and we write papers and things about it. I am struck always by Saidia's work and Kiese's work, among other people. And I'm thinking, thinking about Black Death as a kind of titillation. And I think titillation is a good word, because I think I would push it to ecstatic. I think there's the white ecstatic. And we once pretended to tie that to Christianity. I'm thinking of St. Therese and all of these things, but the white ecstatic is very much tied to the lives and deaths and diminishments of who is outside that structure, whether it is those trying to cross the border, or whether it is indigenous peoples on their lands right now. There's a my friend Nick Galanin, he's a visual artist, and he recently did a piece on John T. Williams, who was a carver, and from like the Nuu-chah-nulth Nation, and he was gunned down by a policeman in Seattle because, well, we know like the stories of because, but he's a carver, and so he had a carving knife in his hand, coming from doing what he does. And I mean, the list of names goes on, but the fact that never makes the news,
right?
The things that happen on my reservation, people would never hear it, and so, and that's what I mean by the statistic. It's such a, in some ways it's stark. Like, they say we're like 0.8 to 1.8% of the population. It shifts depending on, which I was looking at, like, I pulled those numbers from DOJ reports, but I guess just realizing all of the ways that we are disconnected and dislocated from those connections, which is why I think indigeneity is a key to what I call constellating all of us. A constellation is it's not saying we're all the same, but what it is it's noticing, it's being attentive to the space between those things, and it's also being willing to imagine the different ways those things exist in relationship, and so I guess something I think about, and this isn't, now I think I'm starting to go into some of my own theories of existence, but we talk a lot about intersectionality, which I think we all can agree that's a very important concept, and we've also watched how a lot of white feminists have destroyed or morphed or tried to destroy, because it still exists as what it is for people. And in an indigenous way of thinking, we would go beyond intersectionality, right? Like, I think of intersectionality, sometimes the way white people have expressed it or talked about it to me is like they literally think we all rolled up to an intersection and we're like, no, you go first. No, you go first.
Right.
Yeah. And so thinking, I guess, about the ways we aren't willing sometimes to state how complicit we are in that power structure. And so I think sometimes of intersectionality as being like a negotiation of that power, right? Like, who should give it up? Who should cede it? Who should step into the center of it? Whereas some of the ways we think, and I'm not speaking for all indigenous peoples, but thinking about relationality is it's understanding that your autonomy means nothing and actually can't exist if it's not in relation to who is around you. And a lot of that is just being on the res. Like, I grew up and my next door neighbor was my uncle, and the person across the cul-de-sac from me was my auntie, and that your neighbors are your family and your community is your family. And yes, some of us were cousins or aunties or grandmothers, but that's not the relationality we mean. We mean that my actions are in some ways a part of my community's actions. And it doesn't mean that's always in unity, or in some sort of harmony, but that my actions also affect them. And I feel like in some ways that's what's missing about what is the indigenous experience. And we're starting to see it, I think, more present. I think Standing Rock was a big part of that. I think what peoples are starting to realize with the pipelines is a large part of that. But yeah, I mean, and I don't even mean this necessarily as a complaint, but I just mean like the relationships I have right now in conversation and in imagination are very much collective imaginations. Though I talk about them and I try to build them as what I call imaginative trusts. And it's bringing in what is indigenous, what is indigenous diasporic, what is, and trying to create these spaces or conversations where I can exist as a Native and be recognized as a Native. Someone else can exist in all of the ways that their relationships they are. And I don't just mean identity, but I mean like genealogies. Like, where have you come from?
Mm-hmm.
How did you arrive here? And it's not even necessarily about the how you arrived here, but now that you're here, how do we arrive to place? And then now that you're here, how do I receive and how do we receive one another in this place? I think it truly is a practice that I'm still learning.
Could we hear Manhattan is a Lenape word?
Yeah. Manhattan is a Lenape word. It is December and we must be brave. The ambulance's rows of light blooming against the window. Its single siren cry, help me. A silk red shadow unbolting like water through the orchard of her thigh. Her come in the green night, a lion. I sleep her bees with my mouth of smoke, dip honey with my hand stung sweet on the darksome hive. Out of the eater I eat, meaning she is mine, colony. The things I know aren't easy. I'm the only Native American on the 8th floor of this hotel, or any, looking out any window of a turn of the century building in Manhattan. Manhattan is a Lenape word. Even a watch must be wound. How can a century or a heart turn if nobody asks, where have all the natives gone? If you are where you are, then where are those who are not here? Not here. Which is why in this city I have many lovers. All my loves are reparations loves. What is loneliness if not unimaginable light and measured in lumens? An electric bill which must be paid. A taxi cab floating across 3 lanes with its lamplit gold in wanting. At 2 a.m. everyone in New York City is empty and asking for someone. Again the siren, same wide note. Help me, meaning I have a gift and it is my body made two-handed of gods and bronze. She says, you make me feel like lightning. I say, I don't ever want to make you feel that white. It's too late. I can't stop seeing her bones. I'm counting the carpals, metacarpals of her hand inside me. One bone, the lunate bone, is named for its crescent outline. Lunatus, Luna. Some nights she rises like that in me, like trouble, a slow, luminous flux. The street lamp beckons the lonely coyote wandering West 29th Street by offering its long wrist of light. The coyote answers by lifting its head and crying stars. Somewhere far from New York City, an American drone finds then loves a body. The radiant nectar it seeks through great darkness, makes a candle hour of it, and burns gently along it like American touch, an unbearable heat. The siren song returns in me. I sing it across her throat. Am I what I love? Is this the glittering world I've been begging for?
We're talking today to the poet Natalie Diaz about her latest collection of poetry from Grey Wolf, Postcolonial Love Poem.
Something I just wanted to add when because I said the white, I was talking about the white ecstatic. And that's something I think about, like, especially in relationship to what the quotes that you narrated of Saidiya's and Kiesi's, in that. And what I mean by the white ecstatic is it gives them a space to step. I think it does two things. It's twofold. Like, in one respect, it's nostalgic, so that they can look back and recognize the power they have in that. And I think in another way, it allows them to escape having any complicity in it. And so it's the same way that, of thinking about all of the different ways of Black Death that they've invented and imagined. And then even the ways they think about indigeneity and like the idea of the Wild West. It's like, how can they step into our bodies, through music or through dance? How can they step into that body And one of the ways that they believe they can, and I think that's behind it, is that they believe they have conquered. They don't want to step into the bodies they have not conquered. And so for them, I think it's this crazy psyche, which is at once nostalgia for that and a return to their power in that relationship. And then I also think it's this kind of sick way of stepping outside their, quote, guilt or complicity, or that they still have stakes in that power. And I think for me, that's what I mean by that idea of the white ecstatic and how it relates to each one of us, whether it's having been descendants of slavery or peoples of enslavement, or Chinese Americans, or Vietnam, for example. And so there's something about that. I knew I wasn't clear before, but that's one of the ways I guess I think about relating to some of what they've said.
It somehow feels connected maybe to that predatory notion of empathy also.
Yeah, and witness, right? Like,
yeah.
And I think this is now like I can connect to that idea of the predatory in relationship to empathy and witness, because it's almost like, it's almost like going into a department store or wherever people shop, and you can pick out an outfit that is a projection of how you want to be seen, and so thinking like that's what empathy is in a lot of ways. That's one way of looking at it. And I think there's something about that, in that how do I construct the different ways that I would like to be seen? And it's the same extractive nature. It's the same extraction that's happened across time, to come in and extract the land, and then to continue. And it's a never ending extraction, right? Like, I feel like once you become that predator, once you engage in that hunt, for prey, it doesn't end. It doesn't end unless you're willing to stop and look at everything that you have done and take an account of what that means for what you might do next. It's like, yes, they took the land. Well, they took the land. Well, that wasn't enough. They take the water, and they take the water. That's not enough. And so they have to take uranium. They have to take coal. It just doesn't end, and it's the same way thinking about the labors that they tried to take from Africans and, Black Americans today are still being extracted from in that way, just with a different method.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think a little bit of my conversation with Joe Sacco, whose latest book, Paying the Land, is about the Dene people of the Northwest Territories of Canada. It seems like the extraction goes farther. Like, not only is this cutting off through Christianity and residential schools of knowledge of living on the land, of transmission of knowledge across generations, of language being passed down through generations, and then the extraction of resources. But
if I can say something, I think Sacco's book is extractive.
You do?
I do. I think that dip in, and like, to me, that's an example of empathy, but being dressed in it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that only Natives can tell those stories. And I think the importance is for many people to know about one another's histories and stories. But there was just something about that book that to me felt kind of like that extraction. And one of the ways I'll say that is because relationality is all the difference. Some of that information in there I do think is important and needs to be out, but that kind of quick drive, it felt like drive-through writing. And then it's also been hailed as like through the lens of empathy. And yeah, that's a book I wrestled with quite a bit.
Well, let me ask the reason I brought it up was more from the perspective of when we're talking about extraction. The interesting part about it, which also came up in my conversation with Jake Skeets, is about how the destruction of a culture and the transmission of knowledge, and then the only opportunities available within sort of a corporate capitalist extractive system become resource extractive jobs, so that we find native peoples prominent in coal, or or here in the Northwest in timber, or in the Northwest Territories in fracking and oil. It feels like it goes so that extractive or we would call it predatory relationship goes all the way into the interior of like, what are the options for someone to make a livelihood? I don't know if there's a white ecstatic in seeing a native population being tethered to a resource extractive occupation. But I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Definitely, like I teach in the academy. Like I think that's one of the most extractive structures of knowledge. I struggle with it a lot. You know, what does it mean to be a part of the academy, which recognizes itself as a center of knowledge and which decides which knowledges are valued, who receives them, and then especially, you know, like, I mean, from the beginning, it's like from the beginning of quote history, there have been stories of which of our indigenous leaders, and I'm saying our very broadly, capitulated, or it's probably not the right word, right? Because I think I want to be careful of recognizing what choice means in America and what goodness becomes. So, for example, here at Fort Mojave, we I won't let that thing pass. But here at Fort Mojave, we still have a lot of our land that, like, I can look at my creation mountain. It no longer belongs to us, right? They want to turn it into a park or something, which is, you know, the Park Services is another racket. But I look there, I see where the fort was, which we no longer, of course, own. Where the fort was, which became the boarding school. However, we had a sub-chief who decided to take the government's offer, which split our tribe. And so they moved downriver to what is now Parker, Arizona, or it's called the Crit, because it's the Colorado River Indian tribes, because they thought they were going by themselves to become another space for Mojaves, but they also moved in Chemehuevis, Dene, or people from Navajo Nation, Hopi, and then of course it's also the site of the Poston concentration camp, or, you know, right, one of the Japanese American carceral sites. And so that's that's maybe an early example of when someone made a decision that they thought would be better in some way, maybe for them, maybe for their entire community. I think also in terms of this, I think again about what we've learned of what is goodness or what is success, and how those are just traps. They're traps. I don't think I will ever be successful in America because there's someone else's measures of success, and I will always be other and outside of that. You know, I think of like my brother, for example, the brother I write about who becomes the brother, you know, my real life brother becomes the brother in some of my work, is that he didn't have that system of success. The choices he was given, he made, and I can look at them from the outside and say that was the wrong choice, but it's not the wrong choice because it was never mine to make. And I think a lot about what it means that I'm me and he's him. Like, and it wasn't simply because I took a separate, like suddenly I came to a crossroads and was like, Natalie, you can do this or you can do this. Right. It wasn't like that. And in some ways, the mistakes my brother made, or what we call mistakes, or the choices he made ahead of me, in some ways were very protective of me because I had a different path because of those choices. It's not the same analogy, but I really want to complicate that analogy because, you know, I think a lot of this, we can equate it now to greed and money, but I think this began with these ideas of goodness. How could you be a good Indian while you were being occupied by a government? Well, you got in line, you walked the line. And if you weren't, you were punished. You were punished with starvation. And so that is also very much ingrained in us, And so if you wanted to eat, you did what they asked. If you didn't want to eat, you suffered and starved. And for me, that's still happening today. And there's sovereignty is such a problematic word in Indian country or in indigenous country. It's a word that a lot of our young people are struggling with and pushing back against. And yet sovereignty for our older generations is what keeps us visible in U.S. law. But we really do have to question what is sovereignty, right? And we're seeing it now more publicly. It's always been happening privately on reservations, but if the government wants to, they do it. We saw this like very, very much in the public eye at Standing Rock. Mm-hmm. And immediately after some of those pipelines went in, they had environmental disasters right behind it. And so, there were many people in the Navajo Nation who did not want those large mining companies and mines to come in, from uranium to coal. And yet they did. And then you survive.
Right.
And, it's a really complicated process. So it's a complicated process of living under occupation.
I want to take what you're saying now and connect it to something I recently listened to. I attended a virtual event for Seattle Arts and Lectures between Douglas Kearney and Claudia Rankine. And they got on the topic of Afro-pessimism. And Claudia Rankine, while she agreed that today Black Americans are still not viewed as fully human, she believed also, contrary to Afro-pessimism, that we couldn't step outside the system, that Black people had to sort of pretend otherwise about the Black situation, still vote, still elect Black congressmen, still step into roles like Poet Laureate of the United States, still participate within the system while acknowledging that the system doesn't want their participation. And I feel like often when I've seen you talk, you often tell stories that evoke these conundrums, these sort of circular puzzles or traps of living under occupation, as you say. Like, for instance, in your talk with Nikki Finney, you mentioned the experience of visiting your sister in prison, how the bathroom in the waiting room was a complete disaster with tissue and paper towels and everything all over the floor. And that after you went in and cleaned it up to give the place a little island of dignity, the guards would just go back in and turn it all upside down again, that the bathroom being that way was by design. And in a similar vein, you've talked about how the money you've received from the Ford Foundation as a poet is money that's from the prison and carceral system. But the anecdote I wanted to maybe focus on in this relationship was one of your talks at Tin House Writers Workshop, that you were talking about this sense of the inescapable around the Colorado River and how the system of water rights is asserted through how much water you consume, or in another way to look at how much water you waste. You can't demonstrate your water rights through the conservation or preservation of the water. So tribal nations along the Colorado River, if they wanted to keep their rights, would flood golf courses with water to keep the water access. And the Colorado River runs through many of the poems in Postcolonial Love Poem. So I was hoping we could take this notion of living under occupation and talk about land and water and relationship to body and being, because you very explicitly say that when you say, I carry a river, or the first water is the body, that you aren't being metaphorical or conveying a mythos, but instead asserting an equivalency. And I think that's an important aspect of this collection that I would love for us to not skip over.
I think perhaps one of the terms that we should open this with is the idea of the human, to not be fully human. And I talk about that. Many of us talk about that, but that is the problem, is what is the human? And in some ways, like, America can have their fucking idea of the human. I will never succeed to it. It's built into the language for me not to succeed in it. And so in some ways, like, it's important for me to recognize that and then also understand that there is then the space outside of the human that I occupy. And so, like, when you were saying, like, referring back to that line about, this is not metaphor, that's something I know and believe. It's also very difficult to practice that in America. And so when I'm thinking again about kind of critiquing that, critiquing, like, what is participation? And the question, is there a difference between participation and complicity? Can you participate and not be a part of it? Can you participate and not be complicit in it? And the question that's most important for me is the one I have to ask myself within that, which is, what am I comfortable enough to reject of humanity? Because it's going to be very uncomfortable. We're in this pandemic situation right now where we're starting to maybe not ask those questions, but move toward them, or, like, to imagine what some of that language is. Because I do think a lot about the census. I think a lot about voting, and I think those deserve more critique, and there has to be more nuanced ways of discussing those things, because what we've done is said it's this or it's that. And that's exactly what the American blueprint has banked on us doing. We are citizen or not. So in order to be citizen, I have to participate in these things. I don't know that we do. I don't know, that small move of walking into a bathroom at the prison and seeing them walking into that bathroom in the prison and seeing what a disaster it was. Like, that bathroom was in that state because those people at the prison have a definition of what is human, and they wanted me to know, they wanted every other person visiting to know, we were not succeeding as that human. When I picked that up and wiped the counters and the mirror, it wasn't because I wanted them to know I was human. It was because I wanted me in that moment to be able to enter into a space with my sister and have not just dignity, but care for myself. I deserved more in that small space of a bathroom, right? Maybe the smallest spaces of our lives, like a bathroom. It's a thing we do, a very utilitarian flesh body thing. We go to the bathroom, we wash our hands. But it was important for me, outside of that system, outside of what is humanity, to know that my own body deserved a certain kind of care, so that when I entered into that space with my sister, I was also capable of offering it to her. And I think that's, I mean, I think that, and I'm saying this all not imagining for one second that it's going to be easy for us to do what we're going to need to do. And there have been plenty of people who throughout time have done it. I think of Assata Shakur. She's done it and was forced into it in a way. And in some ways, I don't know how I will make my choices about when to not participate or how to not participate. And for me, the question, though, that is difficult is, how will I not be complicit?
also this troubling of the word human, I really connect to, because it feels also connected to your skepticism of goodness. Because if we think of the word inhuman, which means somebody's bad, and that being humane is being good, it feels like there's a whole lot baked into the dynamic of human versus non-human that isn't very examined. That's just assumed.
Well, and that there is anything like goodness. You know, I feel very lucky that, I mean, I know what it means to break the law. I know what it means to add incorrectly. But in Mojave culture, and I've talked a little bit about this, but we had one of our most powerful beings, Pachkarahue, who our mountain was crooked. It's our creation mountain. It's got these beautiful boulder granites that from a distance from here, if I look out the door north, I see it and it looks like a zigzag. But as you get closer, you realize there are these incredible boulder granites. But the mountain looks slightly shifted. He was our most powerful being. He tried to move it, got it almost straight, and then dropped it. And for us, that means like there's no such thing as goodness. And if there is anything, it's the fact simply that we were born Mojave. So we're beyond goodness. We were born Mojave, and there's a strength and a power in it. And we will make mistakes. And you make a mistake, what happens next? Well, you try to do the next thing that has a different kind of energy in it, or you try to reorganize, you know, what that energy is. And that to me is one of the larger questions about what is goodness. And American goodness is for nobody. It's meant for the us and the them. What it's done for us in terms of violence, like the way that America has created these, not just America, I think it's Westernism, but it's created so many categories of violence as if violence is not a natural condition. And then, so we have this wild way of thinking about peacefulness, like peaceful protest, and that somehow is not connected to defending oneself. Like we're in a state where brown and black and queer and trans and all of these other people in general, right? Like, are not allowed to defend themselves. They have to be peaceful and get beaten down in the street. And it doesn't mean that doesn't also have a power. And it doesn't mean that there's anything, you know, I have no critique of folks who that's the way they want to act. And I also have a right to defend myself.
Right.
You know, I think something that's crazy for people is like my partner and I own guns. And we have every right to. And whether that's to hunt or whether it's to defend ourselves, you know, and I think that we've held ourselves to this idea of goodness in a way that that in order for us to be good, we have to be passive, submissive, not speak back, not pressure the system. We have to understand, well, justice will occur. Well, we just need to talk about it some more. Well, just bring me to a place of understanding, you know, make a good case for it. And it's like, no, like, we want to live. And if you want to live, life is such that you will fight for that life no matter what you have to do. This is a terrible analogy, but you know, the same way, like you put an animal in a trap and it will leave its leg behind to get out of that trap, you know, which is a violent thing. You know, I think too, just about the very violence of any kind of life, to watch a plant push up through the ground in the desert and to watch it incrementally try to live. We say grow and we pretend grow has nothing to do with life, but that is a violent to burst a leaf, you know, to drag whatever water you can from this desert and burst out with a leaf. That's a kind of violence.
In Chinese medicine, the word for the energy of a seedling that's pushing through frozen ground is the same word for anger. It's also the sound of shouting, like the way something's so soft and tender can make its way through something that's completely hard and get to the surface.
Yeah, and that's in us. Like, and anger is the emotion I trust the most. And what I mean by that is that for me, anger requires so much of my attention that I am most sensual in those moments of anger. And it doesn't mean that, like, you know, I kind of don't like lose my mind in it, but that's most important, to lose my mind in it, to not have my mind pretending it knows more than what my body in that moment is sensual to what's happening. And, you know, and for me, that is something that very much American empire, what we might call white supremacy, but that's also becoming a kind of generic thing that I'm really worried about. But Western culture has tried so hard to not to dislocate us from our different sensualities, which are anger, which are violence, as much as those violences and angers also teach us about what is tender, you know, what is touch.
Yeah. Something that you evoke really well in Postcolonial Love Poem is the connection between body and land, or breaking down the distinction between human and the non-human. And I wanted to ask you more about where words fit into this, where language fits into this connection between body and earth. Because you say in American Water Museum, you cannot drink poetry. And in one of your Tin House talks, you talked about how when you're away from home, you're sought after as a poet, and that your poetry has a certain currency in the world at large. But then when you return home to the reservation, people aren't as impressed at all with the poetry in and of itself. They want to know what the poetry does, what tangible actions it has. And you said you were talking about how to put your poetry more into the world, into action beyond the page. And I guess I wanted to hear about that. I know there were 8 years between your two collections. I don't know if there's something manifest in your second collection that reflects that, or if it's something not in the collection itself, but some other activities around your poems that relate to this question of not being able to drink poetry.
I was in a conversation with a Grey Wolf event that Kevin Young and Roy Guzman and Khaled Matawa were in, and Khaled was thinking about the pleasure, like that poetry is a pleasure. And I would agree with that, or I would agree with that, if that feels so like hierarchical. Like, well, I'm granting this as knowledge, but when Khaled, was framing this conversation that poetry was a pleasure, it began with Kevin, I think, quoting Seamus Heaney, who had said that poetry is a home. And I had said that I don't know that poetry is a home. I believe it is one pathway home. And, either to return me to home of some sort, or to carry me to a home that doesn't exist yet. And I'm thinking about, like, what is language? It was a gift, I think, from our creator. It's amazing, right? It's amazing that we have different languages, and how it's so difficult for us to understand that there is no hierarchical language. The fact that people around this world have their own language, and that that speech, I guess speech is what I'm talking about. Speech is just, it's impossible for me to understand. And I realize it's a gift, it's a luck. And I also realize that it's very physical. It's another kind of touch. So this is an example I've used before. I feel like I just finished a really large grant, and so I feel like that's why I'm in example mode. I think I've said, here's an example, like 5 times in this. I pardon that because
I didn't notice.
It's not in my lexicon. It feels so outside me, but something I would like to share. So this is not an example. This is something I would like to share.
All right.
Talk a little bit about this in relationship to language. I was leading a language conversation between our elders and other adult learners, which is often an extremely tense emotional space because we have these groups, these generations of adults who were very intentionally cut off from the language. And then we have these elders who had to watch that happen and who now are in a position where they have something that they desperately need to give to these generations. And there's a huge chasm, many chasms that keep that from happening. And so adult and elder learning engagements are really emotional. And we had an adult learner who said, was just kind of fed up in this conversation, was like, listen, I just need to be able to tell my son that I love him. He was 8 years old. And, our elders said, we don't have a word for love. There's no word for love. And, she was getting increasingly emotional, and she's like, well, we have to be able to say something. It can't just be that we don't have love. And which, of course, we know the sentiment or whatever the emotional condition of that is. So finally, one of the elders, who was this adult, it was her aunt, she said, well, what is it you want to tell him? And she said, and she had no words. So the learner had no words. She held her chest. She made some gestures between where her son might be standing next to her, where there was nobody there, and back to her chest. And she was crying because she'd reached a point where she felt failed by language. She felt as a failure in some ways to this language. She felt it was challenging what it means to be Mojave and who we are. And when she broke down, our elders do what they do because they're not old people. They're beyond that. They're an energy that is who we are. And so among the few that were there, they were like, well, okay, we know what that means. You want to say, I would die for you. You want to say, you are my eye. You want to say, I'm going to be stingy with you. Of course we have words for that. And so it was an interesting kind of moment, thinking about language and what it does. And so that was it was almost like a terrible meeting. And, of course, but good things came from it, but everybody left with this additional wound in them. So later that evening, this adult learner came to my home, to my mom's house. I was staying with my mom at that point. I would drive to Phoenix and then come back and forth, but I was staying at my mother's. And so this woman came by and she's like, hey, do you think I can talk to your mom? And I was like, of course, but my mom can tell you if she can talk to you or not. So, she came in and she talked with my mom, and she told my mom in a way that she wouldn't tell my elders, but she told my mom, she said, because she's a little closer in age to my mom, she said, Bernadette, my father never told me he loved me. And she said, my mother never told me she loved me. And I don't want my son to grow up like that. And she's like, even when my father, he died of a heart attack. She's like, even when he was getting wheeled into the emergency room and we were there, by his bedside as they were pushing him up until the room where we couldn't follow him through, I kept telling him I loved him. I kept telling him I loved him, and he still never said it back. And my mom said, my parents never told me they loved me. And she said, but what was he like? Did he have any response? What? He said nothing. And my mom's like, well, maybe he couldn't say because he was sick. And she's like, no, he was speaking. He just didn't tell me he loved me back. And she said, he just kept squeezing my hands. He just kept squeezing my hand and my wrist and my arm. And so my mom said, that's how they tell us they love us. she said, and because our language had been lost, we didn't have that word with us yet. And my mom was explaining, like, that's what her mother did and her grandmother, is they pressed the body, and that, you know, that was something beyond any word that could hold that. And so the next day we went to my elders, and I went to my teacher, Hubert, and I was asking him about that. And he said, I haven't heard that word in a long time, but it's kavanam. And it's the way we press the body when you're sick, when you're a baby. And so there was a moment in that. And so we were able to bring kavanam back into our language because it had been missing for I don't know how long. But just kind of that notion that language is just one way. Speech is only one language, I guess maybe I'll say. If language is this technology, speech is only one way of it. Print is only one way of it. And that it's not the body itself, right? It's not the body. It's an estimation of the body. It's a wish of the body. It's a possibility of the body. It's a thing the body has done, but doesn't mean it defines the body. And so for me, there's something about that power that our people know, that speech can't carry everything. And so to hold the body, to hold the hand, to press it, to feel it beneath you, to remind it that you're there, touching it and holding it. And so for me, like, that's one of the like atmospheres of language that I have been brought into and raised with, I think. And so when I think of poetry, I always want to be like very attentive that I don't lean too much into the performance of it. Mm. And I don't even mean the reading, right? Because if I read poems sometimes about the brother, I can feel my brother in a way that I can barely stand up there. Like, it's all I can do to perform it. I don't know what it would mean to break in it. I mean, recently I read a new essay, and I almost like let myself feel shame about it because I had to stop twice in the middle of it. And I think something that was really interesting about that is right now in this time of pandemic, I'm not up in the front of the room with a bunch of people in it. And so that performance has been stripped down in a way that I find myself so much more emotional in front of a computer screen.
I do too.
It's me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and again, I'm getting sideways, as I often do, going sideways on this conversation. But to me, that's such an important relationship, because when settlers and linguists and ethnographers first came to Mojave, and they did their little lexical vocabulary list and elicited things, they asked my ancestors, how do you say love? And they didn't have a word for it, which was very natural because, and they tried to explain the concept to them, and they had no word for it. And so the ways they wrote about us is that we didn't experience it,
right? That
we didn't feel it. And, and it makes sense to me, right? That you have these white ethnographers who've come in. We've already had the cavalry through. We've already had the military through. These ethnographers come in and are trying to tell us something that is about tenderness and care. And I mean, I would bet that we couldn't even imagine those people felt whatever it was they thought they were telling us about. So yeah, so that's a little bit of, like, I think a constellation I carry with me constantly about language, about its physicality, where it comes from, and what poetry is. In poetry, as much as I'm a very tiny part in whatever energy is of the world, I feel like the land imagined me, right? Like the land imagined a flesh person, and it imagined it from its clay, from dirt. What an imagination. And then for me, like we've been told our creator also gave us language. And I feel like that was the creator's way of giving us an imagination, so that we might make. And I feel like we've made beautiful things, and we've also made very horrible things.
When I was thinking in preparing for the interview, about this question of what poetry does and doesn't do. And you as a poet out in the world and you as a poet back at home. I came across this quote by a Mexican poet, Heriberto Yepes. It was actually tweeted by Natalie Zapico. And I don't even know if this is a question, but I just thought this quote was so great and I wanted to read it. See if you had any thoughts. Viewing poetry in a time of crisis doesn't help put an end to the crisis. It only helps to make poetry, again, a possible solution, a praxis that can really mean something good for the culture it belongs to. He also says, viewing poetry in a time of crisis puts the emphasis on the time of crisis, erases the fact that the institution of poetry is part of the crisis, that poetry is in a crisis itself. Times of crisis help poetry hide its own crisis. I think instead of thinking how poetry can help in a time of crisis, think how poetry has collaborated for the production of a crisis, how that production of a crisis makes a culture risk itself and thus having to strengthen the strategies to perpetuate itself, using the institution of crisis as an excuse, to make poetry a possible measure, to make ourselves forget we live in cultures that are dying, cultures that want to kill.
Well, first of all, his book is incredible. I don't know if you've read Transnational Battlefield.
I haven't.
Oh, so I think this is from Transnational Battlefield. And it might, but he also, this is where he moves. So it might be from something else, but I have a quote that I have a picture of. I'm trying to find it. I'm just looking through my phone. Yeah. So, okay. So this is, okay. I just took a screenshot. My students and I are have read him. So I had some, about me in English. I am possessed by the most powerful revolutionary force in the world today, the anti-American spirit. But I am written and I write in English. I too sing America's shit. And so, I mean, especially that idea of wanting to kill. So I'll use this kind of, I mean, I think he's also talking about something, I think he's talking about something deeper that American poetry is not strong enough for. So I want to say that first, because I think the questions that he's asking are about everything. They're about our lands and our lives and our languages. And I see the critique, of course, of American poetry itself. But I guess what that opens up, and I had this conversation, with my students when we were reading it, and we read it with Spring and All, William Carlos Williams' Spring and All, which I think is another incredible critique. And again, critique, I don't know, we're always arguing about what critique means. I have always thought critique is an attention to, I think the ways I write poems about the brother is because I love him. And because it is a love that not only compels me to look and to touch with my eyes or my words, but it's also one that I very intentionally do so that I remember I love him. And so I think the critique of American poetry is really important. I think it's really easy to say American poetry is vibrant. It is all of these things. It's also very much Twitter. It's if we let it be, right? If we let it be. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to take time with the piece you read, and I'm also thinking about his book in general. And I guess one of the important stakes he places before us or reminds us about is that I think anything we love and anything we do we also must question it in terms of our intentions and in terms of our capacities to understand it. And a big question is like, how do we not waste it? And I guess that's the thing that a lot of us are thinking right now in this time. It's a time of reset if we want it to be. You know, it's a time of, even if we don't know how to do it, like, you know, like for example, abolition is on everybody's minds, even though a lot of people can't imagine it. However, it has been imagined and it is being done. You know, however, at the same time, if we're going to look only in what is, quote, the mainstream, of course we're not going to find it there.
Right.
You can't perform abolition. I mean, there are like a million conversations happening right now about it that do feel performative, like racial justice right now. You know, we've talked a lot about how many schools are out there. I think there was a, quote, racial justice panel at my school that had 1,000 and some digital visitors. And then they did that. They marked the box that's very close to empathy, which is racial awareness, and then they move on and do what? And to me, I mean, there are some power structures, of course, that YEPES is pressuring, but I think for me, what I felt a lot of is the return to myself of what do I think poetry does? What is my investment in it versus what do I think it offers outside of myself? And there's a way that this might be, I can probably be more succinct looking through this end. American poetry is many things, many wonderful, lucky, beautiful things. It also creates a condition for our egos to be the only thing present sometimes. And that's something I try really hard to fight, is how can I be in a room without having to be the center of it, but to let language decenter it in a certain way? How do I not let poetry be a currency of celebrity, of performance, of outrage, of fast time? How can I let it be something that feels like a disruption of what I thought I could do so that I might find what I didn't even know I could do? And there's a way that, I mean, for me, right, like this is maybe an example of that. I know I'm doing a poor job of addressing this, and I think some of it is because Transnational Battlefield and some of their work it's saying the thing that, not that many of us have been afraid to say, but that we hadn't dislocated ourselves enough that we could possibly say it, right? Because you love 1,000 likes. You love, you know, you like to know people are reading your work. But what's been really beautiful about this moment and this virtual world, and there are so many problems with the virtual world, right? Like we don't often think about what the levels of extraction are for us to have this technology, or that when we throw our technologies away, they go to Ghana and poison everybody who has to take them apart. But yeah, I think there's something about this like virtual space that holds us accountable to ourselves and how we engage. Like you cannot fucking perform in this space. I mean, I've seen virtual performances. I've watched my friends do this. My partner, you know, does performative art and has done this, but I'm sitting in a room by myself. And in some ways, like I realize like the discomfort I have in a lot of moments, or I feel like, you know what, Natalie, like quit pretending you know something, like, or yeah, there's a certain kind of care I want to have with language in this space that feels really, really important to me. And I guess for me, and this is what Transnational Battlefield and that quote do to me, is I just want to be careful, and I don't mean careful as in not making a mistake, but I mean, I want to be careful in recognizing that language can be very dangerous, that not being attentive to language can be very dangerous, and that if I can come to it with a kind of intention, and I can treat it like a kind of practice versus a product or a task that I have to do, if I can be who I am with you here and who I am on the page, the way I am with my partner, or the way I move through a day in all its like difficulty or ease or joy or worry, then that's what I want poetry to be to me. Like, I want it to be another way of touch, like I say, touching myself or someone I love or someone I don't know. And that's really hard because it's also what I do. It's also in some ways my job. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think that's also one of the reasons why the ways you're having these conversations, because my partner really loves the show and is always listening to it and asking me about things. In fact, she and I were with the Joe Sacco, we were really going at it. But like, how do we create that space that we believe is the reason why we came to poetry? Like, how do we keep the space in between me writing and what that meant, and then where the poem ends up happening in font or book or text? How do we keep that space in between, which is unknown, which is fallibility of language, fallibility of imagination, and also the complete possibility of it? So I guess, if anything, thinking of the quote you read, thinking of the larger work of Transnational Battlefield, I think that's what it is doing. It's saying, like, don't make this easy ever. Don't take, like, and I don't mean take for granted, but don't assume this is what success is. And in some way that was like a straightforward critique of poetry.
Yes.
As the institution, and then of course what it is.
I want to return to and end with love and a discussion of love, to circle back to the beginning. You've said it's possible any word is a myth, a small myth, a large myth. A word is never what it is, but a desire for the thing to be, either for understanding or for want or for remembering. And in your first collection, you use myth as a way to engage with your brother, who at one point is Icarus, and another point he's Judas, and many times he's an Aztec god. But the collection, your first collection, ends with poems to an unnamed beloved, which seems to be more of the focus of postcolonial love poem. Yes, your brother returns, and yes, there are poems that were part of a letter correspondence with the poet Ada Limon, but often you're addressing the beloved without the beloved being named. And I want to read a couple of things you've said about love and see if they spark any thoughts for you. The first is, the love poem is maybe at war with the colonial state. The second is, a dangerous way of thinking is that we love as resistance. I understand that, but I refuse to let my love be only that. I'm not loving against America or even in spite of it. I'm loving because I was made to love. Love was made for me. And the third quote is, in order for me to be possible, I have to create conditions in which love is always possible.
Love, huh?
Love, I know. The love, the word that has no Mojave word.
Yeah. I use the word love a lot. I know it's something like poetically, at least when I was younger, people were always telling me, "Oh, well, you don't, what do you mean by love?" And
well, I know you say you use the word hand a lot also, but the word that leapt out to me that I noticed repeating itself a lot was hip.
The hip, love, desire. I think the ways I've learned love, and I've mentioned this before, and my great grandmother was the first person I lost in a way that I knew what loss was. And by that, I don't mean loss. Yes, I mean loss absent. She was gone. I remember walking into her room the next day and her literal physical absence, to see her not in her bed, to see like her sheets folded and just what I knew in that moment. Yes, I knew she was gone. Yes, I knew she was absent. And then I also knew something more of myself. And by that, like, to me, that is what love and loss are. I mean, we've been taught to not be selfish, but I think any life has to be selfish, and not in the ways that we've heard about selfishness, as in you're not thinking about someone else. But shouldn't I be selfish if I want to live? And in America, you have to be so fucking selfish to make it through any day, to be yourself in a day, to come from the reservation, which is where I'm at now. It's where I'm talking to you from. For me to get through a day here I have to be very selfish. And some of that is a reminder of many things, that I am loved, that I can love. But when I think about, and so for me, like, the reason why I'm bringing her up is because she was the first person who taught me that I did love. And I learned it when she was gone. Mm. I learned it. It's not that I didn't feel things like it, but when she was gone, my body understood what love was. And so love in that way was not her literal absence, but it was the way that my body suddenly knew what absence was. And that was love. And so that, and like thinking about desire, which I feel like I very much learned from her, and from the ways I took care of her, and the ways I tended to her, the ways I touched her, because she was a double amputee. She required insulin shots. She had wounds, we had to be very careful with. She, small things like giving her cup. She had this giant blue cup with a little plastic straw, and like just watching the way sometimes I missed her mouth and her mouth would try to find that was desire. I've talked about this before, but she would ask me to rub her legs, which were not there, and that I did it for her. I didn't question her. I didn't understand it, but I don't know that there was a truer touch than me touching what was not there of her legs for her because they ached. And so for me to rummage my hands, to move my hands in those sheets where nothing was. And so the hip for me is, I think that's the primary doorway for me of desire. And that I felt desire, beyond any love, like sexual or platonic, there with my great grandmother, touching her hip, learning to bathe her. And so for me, those images are the foundational images. It's as foundational as my river, my desert. And I think about that, right? Like, if I could touch everybody I touch the ways that I touched her, with such, again, not carefulness, but care, in ways that I still remember, thinking about some of those touches, and that what they were was me existing. And so I think that's something I think a lot about love. Like we pretend we can offer it, and we pretend it's ours to give. And it's not that those things don't happen, but I think what is, for me, the question or the inquiry or the wonder, I guess, the wonder about it is that it's the way I exist. The ways I touch people is the way I exist. And it doesn't mean I don't cause people pain or have not, or cause people pleasure or have not. It just means that that's the kind of love I'm imagining. And so it has been a kind of, it's a, like, for example, it's not different than the ways I say that my land and my desert, that I am one of my desert's pleasures. That when our Creator made us, He created something that was full of energy, and like that was a pleasure for the Creator. And to think about that is that we weren't imagined of nothing. Like, we were built of clay that already existed. We were built of clay and water, and so to think of this like reorganizations of energy, and that love is something like that. The conversation I had with Ada was very much, I wanted to speak to Ada the way I feel about Ada. And when I feel about Ada, it's not different than the way I feel about my lover, my partner. Like, those feelings are the same, except we have learned to define the touches of those as different. And I'm, and so there's a way that I've tried to always move backward toward what I became through my relationship with my great grandmother, and what a generosity that was, to care for her. I recently, right before the pandemic started, and so this is similar because you had mentioned like to love against the colonial state. So my grandmother was sick with diabetes. That's what killed her. That's what put her in that bed. I never knew her when she had legs, but my mother, right before the pandemic, we came back to my reservation in February because my mother had a diabetic ulcer, and it went into her bone, and her body went septic. So she had a bone infection. Her body went septic. They were thinking they might have to amputate her leg. And so she was scared. Everybody was worried. The pandemic was setting in. And so we came back to tend to her. And I remember my body. So it's something that will never leave me, the same way some of my moments with my great grandmother will never leave me. We were there, and we have a very poor healthcare system, so we couldn't get anybody to come to the house. They were trying to, at that point, tell me I couldn't be in the room. And, there's a time when we were, like other people have been, outside the window to make sure things were going well. And my mother's, in some ways, natives, Mojaves, we were taught not to ask questions. So often she just let them do without critiquing them or asking for what she needed. But we wanted to bring her home. And so the nurse was like, you have to learn the debridement. I'm going to teach you how to clean this wound. And debridement is very violent, right? You're cutting away, like it's cutting. But I remember being there and thinking about that, and then having to do that for the first time to my mother. And I was saying this over and over again, and I mentioned it just in a written interview once, but what I had to tell myself the whole time that I was doing this is that, this is lucky. This is, one way I'm loving my mother. This is, and again, like when I think of being against the colonial state, like, natives have diabetes for a reason. My mother had shitty healthcare for a reason. My great grandmother had shitty healthcare for a reason. And they were like very quickly like, we'll just cut your mom's leg off. And was like, no, like I'm going to fight for my, fight for my mother. But as that was happening, it was like I had to tell myself, I'm like, you have language. Like, this is what you do. It has a power. You know it has a power. And this is more important than any poetry or poem you might write, but use it right now. And so I had to tell myself as I was doing that, like, this is lucky. This is my mother's body. This is me touching her. This is something I can offer her, and her body is offering me this, and this disease wants to live like anything else wants to live, the same way I want to live, the same way my mother wants to live, in the same way that I want her to live, and so like I imagine myself even talking to the wound, like here you are and here I am, and now I'm touching you, and this is an energy we share, and we're doing this together, and I'm going to let you go, and just it was just like those are the moments, right, that say poetry is a lucky place I've been able to arrive at, and even luckier that I've been received there, right, that like small things to large things, like being able to meet you through poetry, and being able to meet those people, like some of my best friends I've met through poetry. And then there's the lucky ways of just knowing, like, yes, my book's in conversation with people. It means something to people. And it's important for me to remember also that it's just one way. It's one lucky way I can move through a day. I can, like, that I could tend to my mother. And in some ways it was, not a great poem, but that was the way that I touched her. That was poetry. It's the same way I craft something on a page. And so, for me, those are the moments when I don't have to, yes, I'm using English, but I don't have to do this against America. I don't have to prove myself to America. And that's hard to do, right? And sometimes I do, I engage it. But for me, like, that painful moment, which for me, again, was very selfish, right? Because I can't imagine losing my mother. And then I didn't want her to be in pain. And then, but that's a moment where I realize, again, sometimes for the first time, sometimes just to return myself to it, that, yeah, we do find joy against these things. I grew up on a reservation. I know what it means to live despite. And then I also realized the importance of not subscribing to going through this nation to be happy. And I guess that's some of what I'm thinking about when we were talking about participation, in that, I mean, yes, this is a nation. I do think there are other iterations of ways we can live together, not as even one, but very differently to live together. And so the ways I'm trying to build my poems right now, or to use poetry to help me think, is that I'm not asking the state for permission. I'm not asking for the state to see me or to love me or to tell me that I'm good. And some of that involves trying to build spaces or offer spaces or find spaces where that happens. Poetry sometimes is that. And then, as Yepes said, sometimes it's not that. Yeah, and I've gone a little sideways with that, but I, yeah, that's how I feel. I guess that's always one of my big questions with it is, our natural conditions were pleasure. Our natural conditions were care and tenderness, and not without violence. I think violence has always been here. I think violence is many different things. And yet, now that we are here under these different occupations, I don't think, for example, democracy is my savior, and I don't know that democracy has a place for me. I think I've learned to, Fred Moten talks about this, right? Like we learn, we adapt, we learn to move within it, which maybe sometimes feels subversive to us and other times doesn't. But yeah, I want to find ways to move in language and outside of those things without pretending that I could ever be their version of what they think life is, which is a human. And again, as I said before, I don't know what I'm willing to sacrifice for that to happen. That's I guess the big pandemic question for me the rest of the time. So
could we go out with one of your letter poems to Ada Limon from the Desire Field, and then also a poem that Rachel Eliza Griffiths suggests is also a love poem, despite its title, Grief Work?
So these poems with Ada were the first poems where I actually addressed my anxiety, partly because I was speaking to a beloved, not an audience or not even a page. So, from the Desire Field. I don't call it sleep anymore. I'll risk losing something new instead. Like you lost your rosen moon, shook it loose. But sometimes when I get my horns in a thing, a wonder, a grief, or a line of her, it is a sticky and ruined fruit to unfasten from, despite my trembling. Let me call my anxiety desire then. Let me call it a garden. Maybe this is what Lorca meant when he said, verde, que te quiero verde. Because when the shade of night comes, I am a field of it, of any worry ready to flower in my chest. My mind in the dark is una bestia, unfocused, hot, and if not yoked to exhaustion beneath the hip and plow of my lover, then I am another night wandering the desire field, bewildered in its low green glow, belling the meadow between midnight and morning. Insomnia is like spring that way, surprising and many-petaled, the kick and leap of gold grasshoppers at my brow. I am struck in the witched hours of want. I want her green life, her inside me in a green hour I can't stop. Green vein in her throat, green wing in my mouth, green thorn in my eye. I want her like a river goes, bending, green, moving. Fast as that, this is how it happens. Soy una sonambula. And even though you said today you felt better, and it is so late in this poem, is it okay to be clear to say, I don't feel good? To ask you to tell me a story about the sweet grass you planted, and tell it again or again until I can smell its sweet smoke leave this thrashed field and be smooth. And then, and this poem in some ways is very like Rachel Eliza, I call her Eliza. Rachel Eliza is very much in this poem, and we begin in talking about grief, the grief she suffers, and the grief she carries, and with the loss of her mother, and just thinking about about the love, what love and desire are in the midst of trying to hold a grief with somebody. Grief work. Why not now go toward the things I love? I have walked slow in the garden of her, gazed the black flower dilating her animal eye. I give up my sorrows the way a bull gives its horns, astonished, and wishing there is rest in the body's softest parts. Like Jacob's angel, I touched the garnet of her hip, and she knew my name, and I knew hers. It was auxochromo, it was chromophoro, it was Eliza. When the eyes and lips are brushed with honey, what is seen and said will never be the same. So why not take the apple in your mouth in flames and pieces straight from the knife's sharp edge. Achilles chased Hector around the walls of Ilium 3 times. How long must I circle the high gate between her hip and knee to solve the red gold geometry of her thigh? Again the gods put their large hands in me, move me, break my heart like a clay jug of wine, loosen a beast from some dark long depth. My melancholy is hoofed. I, the terrible beautiful Lampone, a shining devour horse tethered at the bronze manger of her collarbones. I do my grief work with her body, labor to make the emerald tigers in her throat leap, lead them burning green to drink from the deep violet jetting her breast. We go where there is love, to the river on our knees beneath the sweet water. I pull her under 4 times until we are rivered, we are rearranged. I wash the silk and silt of her from my hands. Now who I come to, I come clean to, I come good to.
Thank you so much for being on the show today, Natalie.
No, gracias for having me and for the time and, generosity to just wander alongside you.
Yeah, I could have done 2 more hours. I know we're going it's already a marathon, but we'll have to save it for another visit.
This is my elder Mojave time, so I hope it's not too difficult to edit me here and there.
No. It was actually more difficult to skip over so many questions that I'll leave unasked for today and imagine a future encounter together.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and again, gracias, David. I really appreciate. And way outside of me, just this is such a wonderful field that you've offered that, we all have the luck to move in and just listen, and it feels like a whole different time that you've altered for us. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm wishing you and your beloveds love and health, and yeah. We'll talk soon.
We were talking today to the poet Natalie Diaz, the author of Postcolonial love poem From Grey Wolf. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naimon, your host. Today's program was not recorded at the studios of KBOO, but at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naimon. For the bonus audio archive, Natalie Diaz contributes a reading from and a discussion of Jorge Luis Borges' Book of Imaginary Beings. This joins bonus audio from Nikki Finney, John Keane, Matilda Bernstein Sycamore, C.A. Conrad, N.K. Jemison, Ted Chang, and many more. To learn about subscribing to the bonus audio or other potential benefits of becoming a listener supporter of Between the Covers, head over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or, if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Jacob Valla in the art department, Yashwina Cantor in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album Imre Lodbrog A Sapatita Me can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.